Hey everybody, Tyler with Meeple Mountain here, bringing you another board game review and tutorial today from our friends at Galactic Raptor's Games. We have a prototype of their new game coming to Kickstarter, Kingdoms of the Deep. We're really excited to show you this next installment in the Animal Kingdom series of games that they have put out. Really excited to showcase the idea and the strategies behind this game as it continues to build on the really exciting legacy that they've put in their games Animal Kingdoms, Roar and Write, and now Kingdoms of the Deep. So let's go ahead and jump in and learn a little bit about this oceanic conquest strategy game that puts you behind the driver's seat of one of our many aquatic species vying for control of Atlantis. Let's learn how to play Kingdoms of the Deep. Kingdoms of the Deep is an action selection game for 2 to 6 players that places you in the role of an aquatic species in the Kingdom of the Deep, attempting to exert influence and become the dominant leader of the oceans by having the most influence in these various capital locations with these gold leafs around them, as well as in Atlantis, the main Atlantean tower, the center of the oceans as well. Players will play through 3 ages in the game of Kingdoms of the Deep, attempting to complete various and changing quests and objectives laid out by various cards that each game will have, as well as some in-game scoring options that will be laid out for them. Each player's faction starts off very similar, but they're able to build a symmetry throughout the game based on the actions that they choose to upgrade and the order that they choose to take their actions in. Every faction has an identical set of 6 cards that they will use turn by turn, laying them face down and revealing the action that they have chosen to take with their faction turn by turn. Once all of the players have taken their series of turns, there will be a scoring round in which players will see if they have accomplished the goals and objectives laid out in that age, in which case they'll move to the next age of the game. After the end of the 3rd age, there will be in-game scoring. At that point, whoever has the most victory points is deemed the new ruler of the oceans. Now that was the very high level teach, but let's go ahead and jump in a little bit and talk about the lay of the board, the factions and how they work, the actions that you can take, as well as your cards. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the scoring opportunities that are laid out for you age to age as you go through a game of Kingdoms of the Deep. Kingdoms of the Deep has 6 unique factions that you can take control of to begin your conquest of the oceans. Now, each of these factions are relatively just aesthetically different at the start of the game, but can be drastically asymmetric by the end of the game based on the choices that you make as you play through the rounds of the game. Today, we'll kind of showcase those actions on the sea turtle board, because who does not love kind, majestic sea turtles, and who doesn't want them to win as they vie to be dominant in the ocean? So, as I mentioned before, every player has a set of 6 similar action cards. All of these are the same for every player in the game. Every turn, you'll choose one of these, place them face down, and simultaneously reveal with your opponents the action that you choose to take. These actions are correspondent to the various upgrades or actions that are laid out here on your player board. We'll talk about those in just a second. Once you use an action, if you're the only person who selected that action this turn, you get a small solo ability bonus as well that just makes that action better for you that turn. So there's a little bit of strategy based on maybe when you think someone else may take an action and if it's worth it to try and strategize on when it's best to take that action to maximize its efficiency. But once you take an action, that card is set aside and cannot be used again until you play your reset card. And once you do this, all of the cards that you've used that were in your discard, along with the reset card, are taken back into your hand, in which they could be used in later rounds of the game. So there is, of course, a strategy about when do you reset, when do you play actions, and how do you balance that. Let's talk a little bit, though, about your action board and what it means and how you can interact with it. So over here we see you have your 5 main actions here, and then you have your bait pile. Your bait pile is correspondent to the shark action. We'll talk about that momentarily. But let's talk about kind of your basic actions here on this side of your player board. The first thing you have is move. Moving is relatively simple. It allows you to take your cubes that you'll have deployed on the board, and it will allow you to move them to other hexes, adjacent hexes around the board. This is going to allow you to start vying for majority in various regions, specifically those capital regions, which are going to be so key to victory points and potentially winning the game. Deploying allows you to take cubes from your reserve and place a number of them equal to the level that you have that action set at, and place them in adjacent hexes from where you have a cube presently. So if you had a cube in one region, you can set cubes adjacent from there. Finally, you have the bolster action. This allows you to place cubes into regions that you already have cubes, which is great. The tricks there is it has to be where you have a terrain focus, which we'll talk about in just a second. And while it lets you put out more cubes than the deploy, it doesn't let you move them around, so it's not nearly as efficient at getting potentially where you want to go as your deploy action. So you'll have to juggle those and balance those well. Now, as I mentioned, bolster is tied to your terrain focus. Well, what is that? Let's talk a little bit about terrain focus. There are 6 types of terrain in Kingdoms of the Deep, each of them with unique art. But really the effect is at the start of the game, every player has to choose a unique terrain focus. So in this example, the turtles chose this coral reef terrain as their first terrain focus of the game. This means at the start of the game, they're going to place one of their cubes from their reserve into each of those reefs, which there's 2 of them in a capital, so 3 out on the board. So they're going to start with some units in coral reefs. Now, no other player can start with a terrain focus of coral reefs in this game, and of course, that is tied to their bolster action. As you progress and upgrade your abilities, you're actually able to get a secondary terrain focus eventually, which will allow you a lot more options in how you bolster and how you get troops out on the board. Next, we have the shark action. Shark action allows you to move and activate the shark tokens that are out on the board. Now, at the start of the game, there is a shark token placed in the middle of the Atlantis Tower, the very central region of the board of Kingdoms of the Deep. This shark action allows you to take actions with the shark, which is either move or consume. And as you do that, you'll move the token around the board, and you can choose to consume units. Interestingly enough, you can consume your own units or your opponent's units from whatever hex that shark token is on. And of course, as you upgrade this ability, you will get additional actions with that shark. Now, for every cube that you consume, again, your own or your opponent's, with the shark token, you will be able to move up on your bait track here. Now, your bait track is going to give you specific little bonus actions that you'll be able to take as you advance it, but it's also worth a set amount of victory points per how many moves you have on the bait pile based on the player count. So for instance, we are set up for a 3-player game, which is going to give you 1 point, victory point, at the end of the game for every 2 moves that you have on the bait pile. So using the shark can be a valuable way to remove your opponent's units from the board, as well as gain some victory points and additional actions. So if you strategize carefully on when you use your shark action, you can do a lot of damage and gain a lot of benefits at the same time. The last action that you can take that's not directly listed on your board is, of course, the upgrade action, this little cog with this upgrade symbol. Anytime you take the upgrade action, you will simply be moving one of your cubes up from the leftmost space to the right one, upgrading your actions. Certain ones will have additional bonuses, such as the move action giving you a free move once you upgrade to a certain point, or the bolster action eventually, at this point, allowing you to take a secondary terrain focus, opening and expanding your options. The last thing we should talk about is the reset action. Now, when you do the reset, as I mentioned, you'll take all of the cards back to your hand, and you'll be able to do whatever of these specific actions you have covered with cubes. Now, as you take upgrade actions, you're able to actually select additional things. So ultimately, you could have a reset action that allows you to do these 4, one use of each of these 4 actions, which can be quite powerful, making your choice to reset much less painful when you choose or have to do so. So that's the player boards, and I hope this showcases a little bit of the asymmetry that you can begin to build out from your opponents. You could choose to be a very reset heavy person, making your action economy a little bit better. You could choose to really double down on a specific action, making your deploy actions just so much more impactful than your opponents. There's lots of choices and flexibility on your player board based on how you choose to play. Now, some of these choices are laid out for you based on the actions or objectives that are laid out in the current age that you find yourself in, but there will always be strategies that are effective. Getting cubes out on the board is never a bad idea. To that idea, let's talk a little bit about the board as a whole and discuss kind of some of the key points to winning. So we'll look at the scoring board here and talk a little bit about what you're trying to accomplish as you play through Kingdoms of the Deep. As I mentioned before, Kingdoms of the Deep is a victory point-based game. So through the course of the various ages that you'll be playing through, of course, players will be working to get the most victory points. These are laid out in 2 standard ways in every game, and then specific ways set by the scoring rounds of the game, and some final static in-game scoring as well. So let's talk about what you're striving for, what your objective is in Kingdoms of the Deep. Then we'll talk a little bit about the board and how you interact and act with things there. So as I mentioned, there are several rounds throughout Kingdoms of the Deep, which will culminate in 3 scoring rounds, 3 ages of the game. So we'll start with age 1. The very first thing that you'll do in scoring rounds, once you get here, we'll see that here every player gets a free upgrade, which is wonderful. And then here we see that we will be adding additional sharks to the Atlantis space, as well as scoring some points. Anytime you see this trident symbol, this is referring to capital cities. Again, that's these regions with this gold leaf, this gold border around them. Those are capitals. There's one for each of the 6 different terrain types within the game of Kingdoms of the Deep. Whoever has a majority in a capital, so for instance here, purple has a majority of 1 in this capital region, they would gain 2 points. So for every capital, you're going to look to see who has majority. That player is going to get 2 points. If you have a majority in all 6 capitals spread throughout the Kingdoms of the Deep, you instantly win the game. So that's something to always watch out for, is if anyone sneaks in and gets a majority in all the capitals, the game is over immediately. Otherwise, if you've gotten to a scoring round and players have at least done a reset, you'll go ahead and go through this age and you'll look at the scoring. Now we see this particular card that we have drawn for this age of scoring, which is age 1 here. So once the marker would reach here, we would look at these things. This is an instant, so throughout the age, we would see that during any action, you can add 2 of your creatures. If you add 2 of your creatures into Atlantis, which we'll talk about here in just a second, you would instantly get a victory point, which is wonderful. And we also then see that there is a set for whoever has a majority in these kind of grassy swampland style hexes, that they would get points based on who has the most. Second, and obviously, unfortunately, third place getting nothing. All friends, it's worth mentioning, all ties in Kingdoms of the Deep are friendly. So if there were 2 players that had equal number in these types of hexes, they would each get 5 points. And we also see then the final is have the bolster and deploy actions upgraded at least once. And if you had that accomplished by the time you get to the scoring round, you would also get 2 points. Now, these will of course change from age to age, so we can see that an entire new set of actions is going to pop up. It's going to lay out even additional objectives for you to strive for. At the end of the game, players are going to get points based on how many units they have in Atlantis, and they're going to get points based on their bait pile, how far that bait marker is up on their player sheet. As I talked about before, every 2 moves on that in a 3-player or 4-player game would get you 1 additional victory point. At that point, you would tabulate who has the most victory points. Whoever does is the new ruler of Kingdoms of the Deep. So let's talk a little bit more about this crazy space called Atlantis here and what it does. Now, as I mentioned before, you have various actions. You have deploy and move and bolster, and you'll be placing additional cubes out on the board, getting adjacent to other opponents, and moving around the board generally, trying to get a majority in spaces that is laid out by objectives, or perhaps in capitals so that you can get additional points, or maybe even sneak that early win if you're able to. One of the things, though, that's worth mentioning is the move action, which allows you to actually move shark tokens or even your opponent's units. So for instance, say I was blue player, the turtles, but if I wanted to, I could actually move some of my opponent's cubes to get them out of a space. Say I wanted majority here, I could actually move or shunt this black cube maybe over here. I could move it here. I could even move it into Atlantis. But anytime a cube goes into Atlantis, things are a little different. Whether it's my cube or an opponent's cube, that cube actually goes to the Atlantis tower. Now in the full game, there will be a really cool tower here where you'll place the cubes and it'll be secret information. But for this demo, we're going to just use this little bag for the prototype. But anytime I add a cube in, I'm going to throw it into this bag and hold it until the end of the game. At the end of the game, all of these cubes are going to come out of the bag, and we're going to tabulate who has the most. Whoever has the most cubes in Atlantis will get 7 victory points. Second place would be 4. Third place would be 2. And again, ties are friendly. It's one of the big ways that you can kind of help remove some of your opponent's cubes to limit their forces, as well as potentially get your own cubes in the bag to get points. Now, of course, it's worth mentioning if you do this early, you can get some additional victory points right out the bat as well once you're adding things into Atlantis. That's regardless of whether you're adding yours or your own. You can earn victory points by adding into the Atlantis bag or tower. So there's lots of things that you can do on the board to influence your scoring, and the objectives are changing very rapidly, so you'll have to always be strategizing on how to maximize the efficiency of your actions, whether that's shuffling some of your opponent's cubes around the board or potentially reinforcing areas where you want to have majority. Always keeping an eye on capital locations, making sure your opponents aren't sneaking the victory by getting a majority in all 6 of those, and always trying to keep one step ahead of your opponents, getting those victory points and watching out for any friendly ties that may let them sneak up on you as well. And that is a brief rundown of how to play Kingdoms of the Deep and what you can expect from Galactic Raptor's next title coming to Kickstarter soon. I hope you enjoyed getting a quick look at how the player boards function, the way that your action selection works, and just overall what you're striving for as you play through a game of Kingdoms of the Deep. But what did I think of it? So, one of the things that I really love about this series of games that Galactic Raptor has put out is that I believe they do a great job teaching generalized game concepts to people. Now, what do I mean by that? If you're newer to gaming, or well, if you're more experienced in gaming, and I say this type of game is a deck builder, this type of game is a tile placement game, this type of game is an action selection game, there are some general concepts that are almost always going to be universally true in that style of game. For instance, if I say it's a deck builder and you're familiar with deck builders, certain things like Clank or Shards of Infinity or what have you, that there's going to be some general rules that will probably be true. For the most part, you can bet that you're going to start with some type of usually similar, relatively similar deck of cards, and you'll be working to build them up. It's usually draw 5, play 5 kind of structure. Again, there's always going to be exceptions to that, but there's some general things that if I say this is a deck builder, you're going to know generally what you're getting into. Same for an action selection game. You're going to have a general idea of like, okay, I'm going to pick this action. There's going to be some back and forth on strategy of how I utilize that action, and usually there's going to be a way of resetting those actions or getting those actions back, kind of pulling things back. And anyway, what I love is that Galactic Raptor has done several of these types of games with the Animal Kingdoms series. For the example, the very first Animal Kingdoms game was a hand management kind of game where you were using a set of cards and trying to maximize the efficiency of the cards that you had to do area control and kind of move around the kingdoms and exert your influence. Roar and Write was a great illustrator of a very excellent roll and write game that taught you the concepts of that game without being too daunting or heavy. And I feel like they've continued that with Kingdoms of the Deep, where it's an action selection game, but it's not too meaty. You're building a little bit of asymmetry in your faction. You're working to strategize on how you make your faction unique and make it most effective with what you're trying to accomplish on the board, and of course beat your opponents. And you're trying to utilize your actions and pull them back to your hand at the most effective and opportune time. But again, all of that is done in a way that's not too overwhelming, not too meaty or heavy, that a newer gamer or someone just looking for a light family weight game, a midweight game, would not be overwhelmed by this title. I think to their credit, Galactic Raptor does a really good job of creating games that are in a series that have unique styles of gameplay that are all approachable, digestible, easy to teach, easy to learn, and something that a wide swath of gamers would appreciate and enjoy playing, would want to get to the table again and again without it being too heavy. So I really appreciated that about Kingdoms of the Deep. I think that the Kingdoms series of games are something that you would love to have in your collection because it's easy to teach someone who may be newer to this style of game or newer to gaming in general. It's something that they could jump into and have a good time with and not feel way out of their depth, no pun intended, jumping into and learning. And so I really liked that. I enjoyed getting this to the table. It's very easy to set up. Gameplay is pretty quick and painless as you run through things. I think it's also worth noting that every game of Kingdoms of the Deep, unless you play it just a ton, is going to feel unique. The map is always going to be a little bit unique in how it's set up. The objectives are quite unique. I can show you here. There is just quite a series of cards even in this prototype. You can see there are several for every age, and there are beginner and on most of these cards, there are advanced variants on the back. And so you could even up your game if you wanted something a little more complex, a little more strategy meaty, by running advanced goals for the ages instead of the beginner ones. And so this game scales really well based on the player count from 2 to 6. All of the pointage is adjusted to make that more or less attainable based on like your bait pile and how you interact on the board. And I think they do a really good job keeping things engaging regardless of the player count. Now, as with a lot of strategy games, area control games, I do think this game pops is a little bit better, is optimized at a 4 or higher player count so that you're really in the trenches on how you're moving things around. I really enjoyed the ability to move opponents' units. I like games that do that. I think that it doesn't give you an ironclad way to hold something down. Like if I have 45 troops in one area, which is not possible in this game, but if I had just a really entrenched area, it's nice that there are several options for opponents to get those troops out, whether to have them be consumed by the shark or moved by player actions. And it's just really nice to see that be a strategy in this game. I love the way that Atlantis works, that you can kind of shunt opponents' cubes there as long as you're hopefully keeping count to get their unit count down on the board itself or from their reserves. And I just really like the feel of this game. The art is very fun and engaging, as with all of the Kingdom series. It's that kind of watercolor, light, very fun, mystical kind of art, and it's very engaging and easy on the eyes, easy to get to the table and just get set up and get into gaming and enjoy. The game plays at a really digestible amount of time, 45 minutes, maybe an hour, depending on your group. It's not a long, day-long commitment to play Kingdoms of the Deep. And I'm really excited for the Kickstarter and the additional components and aesthetics and hopefully factions and cards and objectives that they'll bring to this game. It's worth mentioning that I also got to look at a mini expansion that's coming out that actually adds some additional either multi-terrain, like a certain terrain that's all of the terrain types at once, which is really interesting for how your terrain focus plays into that. And there's also a terrain type that is none of the terrains. It's kind of like a neutral terrain, but they add additional capitals to where the map is a little bigger, and so then you still only need 6 of the what is now 8 capitals, and so that adds some extra thinkiness to it, as there's even additional places you could try to lock down to sneak that early win. So overall, I have to say again, I really like what Galactic Raptor is doing here. I think they're making a suite of games that showcase a lot of different board game style components and gameplay types that are very approachable to a wide range of audience. So with that said, I would give Kingdoms of the Deep a 7 out of 10. I think it's a really solid game. I think that it is really beautiful, it's fun, it's teachable, it's approachable. If you're looking for that family weight, mid-weight kind of game, something that's just not going to give you massive brain burn or take all day like a game like Twilight Imperium or something along those lines, then I think you're really going to enjoy Kingdoms of the Deep and the way that it approaches action selection and really just a really fun theme as you engage in your oceanic conquest. And so I really hope that you enjoyed this tutorial and my thoughts on this new title coming to Kickstarter soon from Galactic Raptor. Thank you again for coming to Meeple Mountain for all of your gaming review and content needs. And as always, happy gaming. Thanks for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. Check out some of our other Meeple Mountain content. I promise you won't be disappointed. This is Tyler Williams, signing off.